This episode is brought to you by a Green X. Be the you he likes. Good to be around anytime, any day. A Green X helps. It doesn't change your circumstances, but it keeps you from caring. Because without thoughts, feeling, or inconvenient opinions, you're more fun to be around. So use a Green X. Isn't he worth it? A Green X, because he's sick of your shit. Hey all you feminines out there, this is Beckah.
And this is Leigh.
And we have a great episode of File 741 for you today. We are joined by our good friend Estee.
Hello.
Who is going to be talking with us about Bitch Planet. About time. This has been on our radar for a while, but we just haven't really had the chance to sit down and chat about it. So here we go.
Yep.
So we'll talk a little bit about what the story is about, and then we'll go into talking about the different characters, the story, the artwork. Estee has some interesting research that she wants to share with us with her criminal studies background.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, she can explain that more when we get to it. So we'll be talking about both volumes 1 and 2, and then we'll also be talking a little bit about the triple features that came out most recently. So basically this story is about this place called Bitch Planet. There is an actual technical term for it that now I can't remember what it is.
Auxiliary Compliance Outpost, ACO.
Thank you. So this is a place that is off-world, off the planet Earth, that sends people who are quote-unquote non-compliant. And the rules of non-compliance seem to be pretty arbitrary. There's a group of fathers that have come up with these rules. The government has created these laws about compliance that seem to be focused on either female identified people or people who don't identify as a certain gender, or who are queer in some way, who are fat, who are brown, who are black. And so these women get sent to Bitch Planet. So this story follows a couple of the inmates who are looking for a way to break out, to change the system, to fight the system. So let's talk a little bit about the characters. So one of the main characters is Cam. Cam was sent to Bitch Planet for... now I can't remember. You know, and some of them, when she has the Megaton teams, it says what they were put in for, but now I can't remember what it was for Cam. Is it important? Anyway.
Everybody was sent for ridiculous reasons.
Yeah, for dumb reasons. So anyway, so Cam used to be an athlete and is kind of the main character in trying to get information about how to get off of Bitch Planet, how to save the other people who are in this compound. We also have Penny, who is there, who is a big woman, and she got sent for basically being fat. And then there's a few other characters that we can talk about a little bit more when we get a little deeper into the story. You know, one thing that I noticed is that most of the inmates on Bitch Planet are black or brown. And so you can tell when there are cutscenes to the fathers and to the people who are on Earth, and the women who are on Earth, the women who are complicit in this system, are white. And that was unsurprising to me. One of the first things that happens is there's a woman named Marion who, when they're doing their intake, is like, I'm not supposed to be here. And there's a fight that ensues, and people go out of their way to protect her. And it just kind of reminded me of the ways in which women of color have always had to fight for white women, and that doesn't often happen the other way around.
Not reciprocated. Yeah, it's so pleasing to see that actual system be represented, that it is disproportionately people of color imprisoned, and it's white people that maintain those systems of oppression. So you don't really notice it when it's so starkly illustrated. And that's really the gift, I think, of comics, is that it is such a visual medium. Because it's easy to think about it in terms of abstract theme, but to see it in your face, very cool.
Yeah, the first thing I noticed with it is that it's probably the most diverse cast of characters I've ever seen in a comic, and it's too bad it's because it's an oppressive story.
Right. Yeah, that is sad.
Yeah.
But it is also nice, again, based on what the system represents. It is a cast of women of color. It's a cast of trans women. It's a cast of women with different body types. Mm-hmm. Specifically as heroes.
True.
And so that is really nice, even though...
Yeah, they're the ones you're rooting for.
Even though the system is the bad thing.
Yeah.
The context is unfortunate. One of the things that I really liked about it is also there's a lot of nudity, but it's never used in a way to be sexual. There's a couple of sexual scenes, but they're used in a very specific way. It's both humiliating because, nudity is often used, forced nudity is used as a way to dehumanize people, but at the same time, it's affirming because all of these women are just existing in this world, and they are comfortable with who they are, and they're happy with who they are. Penny's scene is one of the greatest, I think, in the run. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So Penny is the plus-size character, and so they go through her story of how she got to Bitch Planet, and she's constantly being judged on Earth for her weight. And
for her hair, her non-compliant hair.
Mm-hmm, and her attitude and things like that. So basically when we see her story, she's kind of on trial in some ways by a panel of fathers, which are all the pretty much white males, and they're trying to figure out the best way to rehabilitate her. And so they have technology that says, they can use different types of sensors to see what your ideal self is supposed to look like. So while they're hooking her up to that, we get to see her backstory. So as a child, she seemed like a very happy child, and her grandmother, who's also a plus-size woman, seemed very happy, and they're baking together, and then all of a sudden the cops or the government come with guns, and they take her grandmother, and they put her in probably like a foster care, I would assume. So then it jumps to her in like high school and getting into fights with people because people are once again making fun of her look. Her teacher not really taking her side, just telling her that she needs to comply and, trying to take out the curls from her hair and things like that make her identifiable. So then the council put the sensors on her, and they hold up a mirror to see what her ideal self is, and her ideal self is exactly the way she is. So basically they think she's just not fixable, so they send her back.
Can I say too that her ideal self is wearing the prison uniform too?
Yeah, that's
not
interesting.
Regular street type clothes like maybe you would miss, like jeans and a t-shirt. No, it's still that she's exactly... You don't like where you are, but you like who you are no matter where you are.
And she's cool. Laughing. She's triumphant.
Yeah.
And that scene is so affirming and so great. This scene was actually mentioned. I just read a book called Geek Girls Don't Cry by Andrea Towers. And in one of the chapters, she talks about this comic, and she talks about that scene and how important it is to have that self-love and have that appreciation for who you are as you are. Not to say that we all can't improve as human beings, but, to know that I don't have to be defined by what I look like or my weight or how attractive I am to men.
Right.
So the other thing about this comic, what happens is there's this game, kind of Hunger Games like, called the Megaton, or the Dwemila. And
It's like extreme football.
Yeah, so there's a weighted ball. People tackle each other. It's this big sporting event. There's this thing called the feed, which is basically the internet, but it's very specifically targeted toward entertainment and making sure that people are engaged, I think is the term they use. And so one of the guards in Bitch Planet comes to Cam with a proposition to create a team of NCs, of these non-compliant people.
Actually, before you go into that, we should also mention that the reason why she gets this proposal is because so Marion is murdered, and they blame it on Cam, and so they're blackmailing her and saying that she murdered her, and that's not what happened. But because of that, they're kind of holding it over her head, which is why they are using that as leverage.
Right, so Miss Whitney, the name of this guard, comes to Cam with this proposal to create a team of NCs for this Megaton game. And the fathers really want this to happen because they think it will increase engagement so they can make lots of money. So there's at the very end of Volume 1, they have a practice game, and we can talk about this later, but one of the things I wanted to point out is, of course, they play against the guards, and the guards cheat, and they don't get called out on it, and Cam's team gets a lot of scrutiny for what they do, even though they're following the rules. And it really reminded me of Serena Williams. I was reading a lot about her experience and how there have been those games where the judges have been extra hard on her, and there's a lot of that kind of racism and sexism in the world of sports. And so that just really specifically reminded me of that.
Yeah.
But let's rewind just a little bit and talk about a couple of the other characters that Cam invites to play with her on this team.
Penny is on there most definitely because Penny can take on more than one person, so she's kind of like the blocker. And then Mako, which is an Asian character, is on it, and she's smaller and thinner, and they're worried that she's not going to be able to fight off anybody, but really she's a very fast runner, so they add her to the team so that she could be the one that runs with the ball and makes the goal. So really they find a very nice balance of people to be on the team.
So that kind of gets us a little bit into Volume 2, because they create this team, they have this practice game with the guards, and in that game Mako dies. And Penny blames herself because she wasn't able to get to her. She had a couple of guards come at her, she was held down, and one of the guards kills Mako. And so Mako's father, Mr. Makoto, helped design some of these ships that are used that people live off of the planet in. And so Mako kind of has this connection to this project. Mr. Makoto gets hired to build the arena for this Megaton game for the NCs versus whoever they're going to play against. And so Mr. Makoto comes to Bitch Planet to get specs on how to build the arena, but you find out that he, this whole time, has kind of been a saboteur and has created some weaknesses in these systems in order to be able to destroy these planets and these transport systems in the future. Very Rogue One.
Yes.
So one of the things that's really great about this comic is that it has this really cool 60s B-movie style and vibe. And one of the things that really stood out to me in that particular style is that it feels like this story takes place in the future. It's a science fiction story, but it really helps to highlight how little progress we've made I was just like, well, this is, I feel like there's so many things that happen in this comic that feel so real and feel so realistic, and things that are actually happening, that to connect it to that kind of like Make America Great Again 50s, 60s kind of idealized world, I think really helps hammer home the theme.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember the first volume I read, I feel like I read this before Trump was president, and so then I had a different feel for it, and then now reading it again when Trump is president, I'm like, oh God.
Yeah.
This is all coming to be.
It takes on, there's a real sour tang to these things now, and kind of a sense that there is no bottom yet, in a way that takes away a sense of entertainment that maybe these things once did, like Handmaid's Tale, for example.
Right.
Or this too, which you could have a little bit of remove because it is a fiction, and for me, it's that buffer is pretty much gone.
Yeah.
And I definitely felt like this comic felt more relevant and more compelling to me than A Handmaid's Tale, because I think because it focuses on trans characters, because it focuses on women of color, it feels a lot more realistic, unfortunately.
Which I think is almost barely science fiction, though, too, if you think about it. We don't, you never get a sense of, like, the planet-wide scope, and the technology isn't that far beyond the realm of our own technologies, too, so...
Yeah, if you took away the planet part and just made it like a prison, it's really not that far off.
Yeah. So, Estee, did you want to share any of your research and insight into kind of the current system and how closely it resembles what Bitch Planet's system might be like?
Really, really well. Traditionally in American corrections, well, I'll just start this by saying I'm a criminologist by training, and part of that, what you have to do is study corrections. However, corrections is not my specialty, and there's a really good reason for that, because it's awful and it's depressing, and there's not a lot that we're doing about it to make it better. So it's not my bailiwick. My bailiwick is violence, but there are things that I care very deeply about. Women traditionally are underrepresented in correctional populations, although recently that's been increasing about 2 times the rate. Women of color and people with non-conforming gender identities, people with mental illness, are very much overrepresented in prison communities too. Prisons initially were created as a place to go to reflect. If you think of the name penitentiary, you hear the word penitent in there, that you were supposed to go in there, reflect on your wrongdoing, and come out rehabilitated. In the very early days, men and women were incarcerated together, when women were incarcerated at all. There was a great reluctance to incarcerate women in the first place, because number one, they didn't think they could hack that kind of punishment. They couldn't withstand it. And number two, they needed them as a workforce outside, to raise children and to maintain homes and things like that. That progressed, though, into separate prison systems, as you might expect, because of the incidence of sexual violence and other types of violence that doesn't help anyone really rehabilitate, quote unquote, rehabilitate. And third, kind of the third wave of prisons now, they're basically fortresses where people go to be indoctrinated. And some might find that kind of wording harsh, and there is a lot of push for prison reform that is promising, but that's what it is. Prison is a place that you go to for punishment. It shouldn't be as punishment. And by that I mean, when you go in there, the conditions that you withstand shouldn't be considered part of what is your debt to society. Prisons should be humane places where people can work to rehabilitate or correct themselves, and they're simply not. For women too, in terms of incarceration, as I said, mental health, they're more likely to have mental illness, and conditions also greatly exacerbate those types of mental illnesses. And I don't just mean one. Oftentimes they're represented by multiple mental illnesses. When it comes to healthcare, women are disproportionately impacted. Oftentimes they come from impoverished backgrounds. They have chronic diseases, communicable diseases that are not treated. Menstruation is treated as something that is, what would you say, like another debt that you have to pay. There's recently there was a bill in Oregon where they're not going to charge people for pads or tampons. When it comes to pregnancy and abortion care, it's also really, really poor.
It still boggles my mind that you have to pay for pads and tampons in a public restroom.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
That it makes it seem dirty and private, and that, again, that's a debt you owe society for for any person that menstruates, that you need to do that. The other thing that is also really troubling is there's a very long history of forced sterilization for women, not for men, but for women. And we're talking about not for violent crimes or for crimes like child abuse, but for people like shoplifting. If you don't want to spend 10 years inside, if you agree to have a hysterectomy, then maybe you can be let out. It continues on to this day, too. But what I really wanted to talk about, which I think is highlighted in Bitch Planet, is that prisons are part of an industrial complex. It's part of an entertainment complex, but it's also a major monetary revenue system. And that's what we've seen increasingly in the United States. We've moved from what we call the welfare state, where it's the responsibility of the state to protect and provide equal opportunities and equitable opportunities, to what they call the crime control state, where you just want punitive responses to crime and to monetize that. And just kind of reading this too, I'm a big fan of Blade Runner 2049, and in that one, the industrialist says, every leap of civilization was built on the back of a disposable workforce. Prisons ostensibly exist for punishment and correction. That's their manifest interest. The latent, the big proportion reason why they exist is how to deal with problem populations, how to subjugate them, and how to make use of their labor. So I felt like Bitch Planet didn't have like panels upon panels saying, well, this is how prisons developed and stuff, but as somebody that has studied those things and keeps tab, I felt it was very well reflected and very accurately reflected. So I praise it a lot for that, even though it's depressing as hell.
Yeah, it's a very depressing comic, as interesting as it is, and is at times enjoyable to read, and I like the characters, and I feel connected to the story. It's also very difficult to read. One of the issues is a flashback of Mako as a child and her experience growing up with her father, and her father kind of let her help him with designing these buildings and these transports and these facilities that he would then put in these weaknesses. And before that issue, there's a sexual assault warning that says, this story contains sexual assault. After this issue, it continues with the normal story, so you don't have to read that issue if you know that would be triggering for you, which I thought was really great.
Yeah, very considerate.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump back to that idea about the cruelty of the system. It's like, why is it necessary for it to be cruel? And that got me thinking about the nature of compliance. And then that got me thinking about George Orwell's 1984. And I want to share a quote from that, when he says, "Obedience is not enough. Unless he is suffering, how can you be sure that he is obeying your will and not his own? Power is in inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. The cruelty isn't incidental. The cruelty is the point."
Is she a feminist? Know what to look for. A non-compliant woman hides in plain sight. She could influence your daughter, your wife. She could seduce your son. Or you, if you're not vigilant. Be on guard. Look at how she carries herself. Is she stooped over, weighed down by concerns that her female brain is not equipped to handle? Or does she stand tall, defiant, perhaps bolstered by a dangerous and incendiary temper? Her arms are hard, like a man's. Look for muscle definition, or even, in extreme cases, hair. It's also possible that her arms are soft, but not good soft, flabby soft. She probably eats too much, or she let herself get old. Do not approach her. She is dangerous. I think I'm going to jump ahead just a smidge because I wanted to talk about one of the triple feature stories.
Okay.
I think this one wasn't my favorite story, but the style was my favorite, and it was called This Is Good For You, and it was about these two women kind of get herded into this theater and watch this. It's not a show, it's like a documentary or a...
Propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, propaganda I think has a very heavy hand in Bitch Planet, but it's all about these women who are like, now that I don't work, I have the time to spend to make myself look this good, and I like feeling this good about myself. And it's showing all of these women making changes to their body at this big huge room full of treadmills with this big word that just says fat, as they're all running to change who they are. And the last panel of that comic is so effective because, you know, the narrator is talking about, this is important, this is what you were made for, this is good for you. And one of the women is leaning forward in her seat and she says it with the narrator, and then the other woman is sitting back, and the look on her face, the horror and the disgust and the fear is so real and palpable and just very well illustrated. In Volume 2, one of the main storylines is that Cam is trying to find her sister. So a couple of times Miss Whitney, the guard, asks her, you know, we know you're trying to find your brother. And Cam says, I don't have a brother. And so we get to see the characters in the main story of Bitch Planet are in Compound 2 of this facility. And we find out that in Compound 1, there are what they call basically the first people who got sent to Bitch Planet, the first non-compliant people, and they are trans women. And so you learn that Cam's sister is a trans woman, and Makoto works to get control of the control room at the compound, and he cuts the power, everybody gets out, and one of the things that happens is the people from Compound 1, the trans women, end up at Compound 2, and the women at Compound 2 are fighting their guards, they're trying to get out, they're ganging up on everybody, and when Cam's sister and her friend Rose show up, the women start fighting them as well, because they are also just men who are trying to take things from you. And I was just like, fucking TERFs, you know?
Like, man. Yeah.
This idea that not only are white women usually complicit in these systems, because while they are still oppressed, they still have privilege within white supremacist cultures as the one we live in. So women also can fall into this trap of this sort of gender gatekeeping. And so even though someone may not have been born biologically female, if they are women, there are women out there who say, nope, you're not a woman, like you don't belong here. And so that was really heartbreaking, but also again very reflective of our current culture. And this also is a little bit reflected in another of the triple feature stories, which I thought was very effective, in which there's a woman. It's all about how these white women are appropriating black culture to be fashionable, and they speak in Ebonics and
Miley Cyrus.
And they, you know, have nails done a certain way and their hair done a certain way. And it reminded me of, and I don't recall who said this, but I'm sure several people have said essentially the same thing, that white people love black culture but hate black people. So this one woman, she goes in for some modifications and she ends up darkening her skin. And there's a scene where these white women who have these, you know, the cornrows in their hair and all of these things get pulled over by the police. and they're like, oh, we're just on our way to a party. You just pulled us over because you like us, whatever. And the cop lets them go. And then when this woman who darkened her skin, she also gets pulled over, and she uses the exact same language that the white women do, and she ends up getting killed. And because people treat black women and black people differently than they treat white women, and white people want to be able to appropriate and enjoy that culture without having the consequences of actually being black.
Yeah.
So super depressing, but again, extremely relevant, and I think very well illustrated in that short story. So yeah, Leigh, why don't you share some of your favorites from the triple features?
In the triple features, there were 5 volumes within that, and so my favorite was number 3, and there was 3 short stories in there. So the first one was called Those People, and basically it starts off with a SWAT team being deployed on a barn in the middle of nowhere to capture whatever threat they feel is there, and they're talking about it like they're monsters or aliens or demons, creatures that are going to rip them apart, and so like you have no idea what's there, but you envision it's going to be something hellish and not human, and it ends up being like a little secret gathering of queer folk, and they're having a dance, and it was like their way of saying love is love still, but they're doing it in secret. And so they get there, and the SWAT team is filled with fear already because they've been told that they're these are terrible, horrible beings, and they're out to kill us. So one SWAT guy is kind of shaky on his trigger, and they ask, the lead SWAT person asks for identification from one of the people, so he reaches in his pocket to get his identification, and the guy with the shaky finger shoots and ends up hitting the leader. So then the leader says he's got a gun, open fire, and they end up killing everybody in the barn, and it ended up because it was the one guy's shaky finger, and so he admits that at the end, and they're like, oh, it's all right, that happens all the time, no problem, we'll just say it was self-defense. So that hit hard, because as a queer person, that would be terrifying, and that has happened in the past.
Yeah, they call it preemptive self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I don't particularly like the art style in that one, I thought it was extremely effective.
Yes, I
think,
agree. Again,
this idea of propaganda, this idea of othering, this idea of making sure that you believe that this person, this thing is not human, mm-hmm. and so you don't have to worry about what happens to them because you are totally disconnected.
Right. The next one in that one was called Big Game, and so it starts off with a couple of rangers. There's an older man and a younger man, and they're hunting in the wild, and you think, the way that they're talking about it, you think that they're trying to hunt down like a wild animal that may be coming too close to civilization, and they're going through, and the older guy's giving him pointers on like, when you see it, you want to make sure that you aim here, and this and that, and all these things, and then once they get to the area where they were looking, you see it's like a caravan of people kind of out in a field, and you see the scope going through all the different people, and then you see like a mountain lion, and you think that's what they're going to be shooting at, but instead the tranq hits a woman who's nursing her baby, and then it shows them dragging her off and bringing her back to her husband, because it was all about family reunions, so to speak, but you can see that the husband looks like he's not a very nice guy, and so it was obviously a woman who was on the run away from a bad marriage, and in this society, in this comic, they are all about women not having rights. So, and then the next one is after that is called Love, Honor, and Obey. I really liked the style in that one. They tried to make it like a film noir. So it was all black and white, and it had kind of that 1920s, 1930s feel to it, and it's a detective questioning a prostitute and her lawyer about an accidental death of one of her clients. So she had a client who had a heart condition, and it shows that during sex he says don't stop, and so she didn't stop, and then he ends up having a heart attack and dying. And so now she's in trouble with the law because they're saying, well, you should have known better, you should have stopped. So she's very naive and confused. So she's like, well, I listened to I was supposed to listen to what he said. Well, yes, of course you're supposed to listen to what he says, but I did listen. Well, then he ended up dying. You should have known better. So it was like a double meaning there, double negative, that you should have listened to him, but then don't. And so there has to be someone who pays for this crime, and it's going to be you, whether you meant to do it or not. But then the interesting thing is, instead of just locking her up, they turn around and they turn off a button on her like she's a robot, and they just shut her down, and they're like, well, she's spare parts now. So,
yep, we can't win.
Nope.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing those, Leigh.
Mm-hmm.
My favorites, I think, out of the triple feature volumes, one was called The Invisible Woman.
Mm-hmm.
So what I really liked about this one particularly was it was a tie-in to the main story. So in the main story, there's a sequence where there's a newscaster who's talking about the Megaton games and talking about this new NC team and whether or not they're going to be able to do it. And so what happens is, in the background, a lot of really great things happen in the background of these shots. You really need to pay attention to, I call them shots, panels. You really need to pay attention to what's happening in the background. So there's this woman in the background, and she lifts up her shirt and flashes the camera, and then gets tackled by a guard. So this extra story is actually the story of this woman. And so she works in this office, and wants this promotion, and she goes to this hairstylist, and she says, my boss said, I would be a good candidate if I was bigger up top. And so she's getting her hair done to get this like huge hairdo, and the stylist is like, yeah, he meant your hair, sure. And so she goes back to work with this big hairstyle, and there's this other secretary that's got these huge boobs, and she goes in to talk to her boss, and they said, oh, we went with a blonde. And so she's really disappointed. She leaves the office. She gets fired because she has small breasts. And so she leaves the office, and she sees these women who are part of this revolution to kind of keep the idea of President Eleanor alive, who was the president before this kind of whole father's government took over, and who is in prison on Bitch Planet. But she sees these women spray painting on these advertisements, and so she ends up writing on her chest and going and flashing the camera. So I really liked that tie-in to kind of see that these people are affected, even if they're not on Bitch Planet. There's all of these things that are happening on Earth that affects these women in these different ways. So I really liked that tie-in.
That, can I say, in that story too, the really cool thing that I loved is that the women had rappelled down and were spray painting the ads, and the fired businesswoman says, hey, I see what you're doing. And the one looks down, she says, we see what you do too. And then she's like radicalized in that instant. I loved that.
Because again, this idea that you are valuable based on what you look like. So if you have small breasts, if you are too fat, if you are too tall, if you don't have the right skin color, then you're not as valuable and you're not as seen. And so that is just so cool to have her, and then be on the camera and all of that. My other favorite story was called What's Love Got to Do with It? So it's about a woman who's a nurse who is paying this old maid tax because she's in her 30s and she's not married yet. And so her family is forced to pay this tax. And so they were like, you have to get married. You have to find somebody. We know it's hard. Like,
they're going to lose their house.
It's really bad. And so she goes on these dates. There's this great page with all of these like men's profiles and like the things that they say, and there's a little footnote that says these are actual things that actual people have said to other humans. Dating is fun. So what ends up happening is she gets really frustrated because she finally meets somebody she likes at a bar. They hit it off. She goes off to the bathroom. She comes back. He's making out with somebody else. She just is like, I can't do it anymore. So she and her sister find out that there's a loophole in this old maid tax, in that she becomes a surrogate mother. So she carries a baby for a couple and gives that baby up. And one thing that is so devastating is there's a scene where they hold the baby up and they have this little color meter of like how dark the baby's skin is, and they're like, well, it was pretty close, but you did it, you're exempted from the old maid tax. And it's just very disheartening. But again, everything about these comics, the triple features, the main volumes, is so effective in portraying the casual misogyny that we all have experienced, the very violent and pervasive hatred of women and the desire to control women and their bodies, the hatred of black women and queer women and trans women. It's, like I said, incredibly effective, but also really depressing.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of our interview that we did with R. Allen Brooks, and he had mentioned that when he had first started doing stories and comics, when or maybe he was quoting about the Twilight Zone. I think it was what he was talking to us about, that how, if I'm doing all this social commentary, I get it smacked down when I want to see it published or created, but if I put it in the context of science fiction and I turn, races into aliens or things like that, then all of a sudden the storylines are passable, and then it's a topic we can talk about. So I feel like this is a good example of that. They put it in a science fiction context, and then this is a social commentary that, was made.
Yeah, and I think there is a little bit of hope in some places. There's this idea of President Bitch, of Eleanor, who is kind of the idol. There's this idea that there are ways to fight against the system. One of the things I really love is that everybody is willing to fight all the time. There's fighting happening all the time. It's not about how do we scheme, how do we, come up with these secret plans. People are just punching these guards in the faces. And again, a lot of that is kind of happening in the background because it's so normal for this society. And as much as I don't advocate violence and murder necessarily, there are ways in which we can and should continue to fight these things. And as every day we're seeing more and more laws and regulations that are stripping women of their rights and stripping trans people of their rights, the more I think about, what do I do? What influence do I have? And I, as a white person and at times cis-passing, have more influence than other people. And so really seeing these stories, hearing these stories through the perspective of women of color really helps me think about what I can do and what I should be doing.
Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes that message that violence is not the solution is part of a patriarchal trap. That they tell you that is don't try violence because it's not going to work. It's not going to be successful. There's a great article, I think is in one of the triple features in the back. A black feminist writer wrote an article about the utility of violence. And the reason that the civil rights movement worked in the 50s and 60s wasn't just because of Martin Luther King's nonviolence, but it was coupled with the Black Panthers and Malcolm X's threat of violence. Violence is a tool. I study terrorism. I know I'm not advocating it necessarily, but there are in certain contexts when it becomes necessary for self-protection, to motivate for change. Sometimes that's the only thing that people in systems of oppression will respond to.
And think of all the wars that have happened. Same thing.
Yep.
Depressing.
I wanted to backtrack maybe a little bit to what Leigh was saying about how this is science fiction, which makes it seem kind of futuristic. But I did a lot of research into women in prison films, which this is clearly an homage and built on that, which has a really old lineage. Basically, as soon as they started making movies, what is that joke? They made movies and then 20 minutes later they made a porno. The second they could, like, so women in prison films have been happening since the 1930s and the 1950s. They really started to break out in the 60s and 70s. They got really salacious. If you see even some of the titles like Caged Heat and all that stuff, it can be really gross. It can be. There's a lot of nudity, focus on voyeurism, like shower scenes and cat fights and strip searches. A lot of sexual fantasies like lesbianism and rape and sexual slavery, fetishism, bondage, and all that kind of thing. Sadism, too. There are lots of different types. American prison movies, Italian, Asian. They even had subsets of jungle prison movies, women in jungle prisons, and Nazi prison camp movies. Really gross when you think about it.
Yeah.
However, there is an interesting subtext to a lot of these films, and it's the fact that there's one tagline from probably one of the most famous ones called Caged from 1950. Desperate women because the law forgot them. They're salacious and they're lurid, but they're also extremely transgressive, these women in prison movies, because they highlight the corrupting and corrupt nature of the prison and its disproportionate impact on women. And so it is transgressive in that way. There's this theorist, Suzanne Borchen, she wrote an article about it, that there are strong feminist interpretations of these women in prison films. She said they provide imagery, material with which to base a more just legal system that is responsive to women. These films are actually very critiquing of these prison systems. And that these women in prison films may then go beyond eliciting sympathies. They may extend our empathetic range. So I think it's brilliant that they put that in the framework of the women in prison exploitation frame. Because at first, in the nature of the name itself, exploitation is going to be lurid, it's going to be dehumanizing. You dig a little deeper, there's an extremely feminist, transgressive character to these films that this really, really replicated.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, just looking at the cover of the first issue, you know, it looks like a 60s kind of 70s B movie, and it says girl gangs caged and enraged. Like, it's this idea of subverting that trope, like taking over that genre, taking control and telling your own story.
Yeah, and they do it in an interesting science fiction way because the prison is pretty much run by a system, and it's an AI system, and it's a white woman that they have different personalities for, and it, you know, kind of directs the women on what they're supposed to be doing. So there's a nun, there's like a dominatrix, there's
a Barbarella.
Yeah, there's like a whole bunch of different personalities that she takes depending on who she's speaking to and what's for and what they want to get out of the prisoners. So that's always a very interesting idea. And then going back to what you said about the shower scenes, there also is a section, the title at the top says obligatory shower scene, which I was cracking up about because that's, you know, exactly what you expect. And once again, there's someone peeping in the showers, and he ends up becoming, you know, their informant because they blackmail him.
But what I liked about any of the shower scenes is that even though there was a peeper, at no point did I feel like it was occupying a salacious or a male gaze.
No.
Even though you could, you know, it was nude and some people were engaged in sexual congress. It did not, I don't know how they did it, really. To draw it that way, or just the tone or the frame, it did not feel like it was occupying any other gaze except somebody on a peer level. Going into a shower, that's how we talk about. This is a place that we can be a little bit freer. And a type of intimacy that doesn't always have to be sexual.
Yeah, because the guards couldn't go in because they're wearing armor, and then also they wear these weird face masks that because I guess the alien world that they're on affects your body and your skin, so they wear these masks to make sure that you know, the guards don't get affected by it. Prisoners, they don't care, but yeah, so they can't go too far into the shower, so they stay by the door. So it's like their only place of privacy, really.
Well, I think this just highlights how great comics are and how effective they can be in talking about very real and very relevant issues. You know, Leigh and I love to talk about things like rat queens and bingo love and the things that feel lighter But we also choose these things specifically because they have these messages and they have these perspectives that we feel are important to be represented. And so just thinking about how effective this comic is, I really wish more people knew about it. I know there's a big group of people who know about it and cosplay and tattoos and are supportive of it, and I hope they will continue writing it if they're not already. Kelly Sue DeConnick, who of course did a big Captain Marvel run, and then the artist Valentine Delandro. I hope they're working together, and of course there's a lot of collaborators on these issues, but this is why we do this podcast. Yep. So that we can talk about, it may be really difficult to talk to somebody about what it's like to be a woman or what it's like to be a queer woman, but to give somebody this comic, even though it deals with very real issues, the way the art is drawn, the way it's structured, the way it's set in a kind of sci-fi sort of setting, the really great satirical advertisements at the end of each issue can be a little more accessible.
Women are naturally more self-conscious than men when it comes to their appearance. Naturally, it's not conditioning or systematic oppression, ladies. It's just nature. And really, the weight of responsibility for aesthetic crimes does lie on the shoulders of all women, so do your part to hide your heinousness. But, wait, makeup is also a lie! You ugly cow, he thought you really did have cheekbones that were cut with a laser. You tricked him. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't, you lying strumpet. Might as well steer in Miss Andre Cosmetics. Destroy the patriarchy with your pretty, pretty face.
I think you guys talked about your favorite stories. I think it was in Penny's interrogation. The favorite thing that made me kind of like put it down and like take a walk. And it was the quote, "Why must you be so angry?" And for me, really tapped into my anger. But as a kid, I was always taught that my anger was wrong, that it was a mistake, that I shouldn't feel angry about things that happened to me or other people, that was selfish in a way. And it was only as I've gotten older, the gift of age, I guess, that I've really tapped into that anger. And I'm like Hulk, I'm angry all the time. There's so many reasons to be angry, and that really just highlighted for me that it's okay to be angry and that it's good to be angry, because let that be an engine for you to look out for yourself and look out for others and try to motivate for change. So that was the most profound. Why must you be so angry? Let me count the ways. And I'll be brave to do it now.
Can we talk about the ads?
Yes.
All right. So in this comic, one of my absolute favorite parts of it were the ads in between each of the volumes. They really tried to make them, they were reminiscent of like the old comics. I remember when I was a kid, I would go to the comic store, there'd be like the 10-cent bin, which are all the old comics from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, something like that. And in those ads, they always had where you cut out a little corner that has the little order form, and you send it to a P.O. box with your, check or money order, and you check off the things that you want on that page. They have a whole bunch of things advertised. Usually it was like a decoder ring or something.
X-ray glasses.
Yeah, things like that. But
monkeys.
This one is all like, the stuff that has to do with this patriarchal society. So that could include, what were some of the things?
Douches.
Yeah, like they basically were just making it like, you're a woman, you're disgusting, so here's all this crap
you're
that
wrong.
You can send.
Yeah, here's the ways you can correct yourself.
Yeah, and so it's like junk that's supposed to make your body smell better or your vagina smell better and all kinds of terrible, awful things.
To make you more agreeable to your man.
Yeah, how can you be more compliant? Here's all these ways. And but then they also throw in like some old newspaper classifieds like they're misconnections, and it's, you know, some guy who's being really ridiculous and only remembers a woman for something about her body or some situation like that.
My favorite misconnection was one where it said, we were at the bar and you pushed me up against the wall and stuck your hand down my pants, and I didn't get a chance to like knee you or punch you in the face, and I'd like to be able to do that or something that. It was great.
Yeah, they were really very funny. And the weird thing is that in the corner there actually is a P.O. box address in Portland. I wonder how many people have actually sent that out. And then in volume 2, there's almost like a Dear Abby one where you can email them. And I wonder if people have tried that too. I'd be very curious to see if they got any response or if they just kept your money.
I liked how some of them said, "Hey kids, patriarchy," at the top.
Yeah.
I felt like it was like in John Carpenter's where you put the glasses on and you're seeing what things are really, really happening.
Right. Yeah, very clever and a great way to kind of tie up each issue.
There was also the ones that you were talking about where, you know, is she a feminist? And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, how to identify a feminist, and it talks about, you know, hair on her arms or thick legs or glasses, but maybe not. Maybe she's wearing contacts. She's duplicitous. Stay away from her. So it's really fun, again, in that way that's like, well, yeah, I recognize this and it's terrible, but let's poke fun of it at it because what else can we do?
Right.
Get angry.
Well, yeah. Punch a Nazi in the face.
Awesome.
All right. Why don't we close out then?
Okay. Well, this has been another exciting adventure with File 741. I'm Leigh.
And I'm Beckah.
I was Estee.
Thank you for listening, and please like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can tune into all of our podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at thefemininfiles.net.